Welcome, Duke alumni and friends, to this session of the Duke Alumni Forever Learning Institute, an interdisciplinary educational program organized in a set of thematic courses. My name is Britton Bitterman. I am the class of 2001, and I'm also the outgoing chair of the Annual Fund Advisory Board. Thank you so much for joining our program today, The Impacts of Climate Change. This program is part of our theme, Climate Changemakers, inspired by the Duke Climate Commitment. Moderating our discussion is Norman Wirzba, the Gilbert T. Rowe Distinguished Professor of Christian Theology with the Duke Divinity School. Welcome to the Forever Learning Institute, Norman.
So it's great to be with you all. I am Norman Wirzba, and I had the great pleasure this last fall of co-leading with Emily Bernhardt from the biology department, a university-wide course called Let's Talk About Climate Change. This course was designed in a way to respond to one of the sort of signature elements of this climate commitment at Duke University, which is to increase climate literacy, which means how do we help both students, faculty, and staff understand more clearly, and I think in much more realistic ways, the many dimensions of climate change. And what we saw in thinking about this course and designing the course is that students were often thinking that climate change is really a technical issue. It's about learning about parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. And in terms of responding to this reality, that's primarily the role of engineers and technicians. And without question, these are very, very important elements to thinking and also addressing climate change. But we wanted students to understand that climate change is something that cuts across all sectors of our societies. And so when we designed the course, we thought it would be very important to bring faculty from various departments in the university to help students understand the whole complexity of climate change, but then also for students to be able to see that in their varying disciplines of study while they are at Duke, they can still intersect and become change agents in whatever field of work they choose to do. And as we recruited faculty, we had 45 faculty who wanted to participate, which is an indication of just how strong this desire is among our faculty to really address one of the world's great problems. We could only choose 12, but we chose 12 who came from the humanities, the social sciences, the professional schools, nursing, medicine, and these were people who really broadened the understanding of what climate change means right now in our world. This is not a future hypothetical possibility, but is affecting people on the ground in many, many parts of the world. And these faculty were so energized engaging with each other. And so I'm delighted today to introduce to you 3 more faculty who were not climate fellows this past year, but just another example of people who can bring so much insight and also give us the kinds of knowledge we're going to need to address climate change. And so today with us, we have AnnMarie Walton from the School of Nursing, Sarah Bermeo from the Sanford School of Public Policy, and then Lee Miller from the Law School. And they're going to engage us in conversation in pairs. And the first pairing that we're putting together is AnnMarie and Lee. And so I want to just start out putting a question to both of them as they're going to talk for a little bit amongst themselves about how you think multiple sectors have a role to play in climate change mitigation. Or to put the question in a slightly different way, how is climate change everybody's problem and not just the problem for scientists to think about?
Thank you so much, Norman. Thank you for having us here today. And I'm happy to start off with this question. I think when we think about climate change, we think naturally about the energy sector and the transportation sector. But as a nurse and a clinician, I don't very often think about the impact of the healthcare sector. And so I want to begin by sharing a slide with you all to show you the contribution that the healthcare sector makes to climate change and to greenhouse gas emissions in particular. I was really surprised to learn myself that as a sector, the healthcare sector contributes 8.5% of U.S. greenhouse gas emissions. And we'll talk a little bit more in a second about exactly how this happens. If we look at the greenhouse gas emissions globally, you can see that China is the largest producer of greenhouse gas emissions. closely followed by the United States. But if we pull out just the healthcare sector as a sector and pretend that it's a country, it actually emits more greenhouse gases than the United Kingdom. So this is really striking to think about what a huge polluter we are as an industry. Can you flip back to that first slide? I want to go over some of these gray clouds that I have here for you. And I will share that I pulled this resource from the Nurses Climate Challenge, which is a group that is asking nurses to be educators of other clinicians and patients about climate change. And specifically, this image comes from Healthcare Without Harm. So you can see here that we are impacting in energy. So we are the second most energy intensive facilities in the country, and we use 2.5 times more energy per square foot than other commercial buildings. We are the hospitals, is who I mean as we, speaking as a nurse, we are ranked as the third most water intensive public buildings, only after senior facilities and hotels. We use an average of 570 gallons per staffed bed per day. And water is a major contributor to greenhouse gas emissions because we need energy to distribute it, to heat it, to treat it. We also serve a ton of food to our staff, our patients, and our visitors. And since an estimated 14.5% of global greenhouse gas emissions come from the livestock sector, hospitals can make a huge difference by serving less meat. And we'll talk about some solutions in a second. The other point I want to make is that U.S. hospitals generate 29 pounds of waste per patient day in the hospital. And then in the creation and transportation of the products that we purchase to use with patients, we create 32 pounds of waste for every pound of product manufactured for use. So we are huge, huge consumers and polluters as a sector. And we also have the power to contribute to solutions. So I will just mention a couple of these and then I will turn it over to Lee. But I am proud to say that we have made some steps forward as a healthcare sector. There are hospitals that are offering plant-strong diets where they're talking to patients about the benefits of a plant-strong diet, giving the opportunity to order plant-based meals off the menu, showing recipes for those plant-based meals on the hospital TV programming. There are also hospitals with rooftop gardens allowing what's grown super locally to be served in the hospitals and also giving nurses and patients and physicians a nice space to go. There are hospitals where nurses are creating sewing mats from surgical wraps and giving those out to people who are experiencing homelessness. And then right here at Duke, we have made some pretty significant procurement changes. We've moved to reusable pitchers. We've made shifts in our inventory management and how much we're keeping on hand. And we've moved towards something called environmental procurement sustainability, where we have an environmentally preferred sourcing strategy, and that is considered when any new product request is made. We've also, during COVID-19, converted to obtaining N95 respirators made only in the US and Mexico, and that has a huge impact on greenhouse gases and transportation. And then we're also starting to do some device reprocessing. I can also say that within the School of Nursing, we have students looking at the impact of waste anesthetic gases in the hospital as DNP students, and that's very, very exciting. So what I want to leave you with is this, that the healthcare sector is also a major contributor to climate change. And also has a wealth of solutions to offer. So even we as clinicians who are doing our best to help patients need to be also thinking about our impact on the environment.
Yeah, AnnMarie, that's so interesting. And I hope that there's not going to be a quiz after this because that was so much new information for me that and I think it's going to take a little while to process it and kind of organize it in my own head. And I just had no idea about pretty much any of that. And maybe that's the theme that really ties us together. I work in the field of agriculture. I should say I am a farmer. My spouse and I keep a herd of sheep out at our place just north of Hillsborough, near Durham. And so even though I'm about to maybe provide a little critique of my own industry, but it's an important one, I think, because like healthcare, agriculture is a really important but often overlooked source of greenhouse gases. I think you said healthcare was 8.5% or so. The best estimates we have for ag is about 10% of the greenhouse gases in the United States. And if you take the food system more holistically, most folks seem to agree it's closer to a third. And that's a huge deal, right? It's not electricity and it's not transportation, but especially as those sectors begin to decarbonize, the share of healthcare, the share of food and farming is only going to increase, and it's only going to become more important that we start thinking about mitigation in those areas. So I'll say I raise sheep on the one hand, but a lot of my work, I should say, is really around the factory farms or concentrated animal feeding operations that exist in the eastern part of the state, in the eastern part of North Carolina. And they are an important source of methane. And methane is a particularly nefarious greenhouse gas. So it's often cited as about 30 times more potent in terms of its warming potential compared to carbon dioxide. And I would actually say that it's worse than that, because most of that warming, that climate forcing potential of methane is happening early on in its time in the atmosphere. And so in terms of kind of what when we're thinking about policy relevant windows, maybe over 100 years, methane is 30 times worse, but over maybe a 20-year period, it's actually several times worse than that. And the fact that all of this methane is coming from these pig farms in our backyard, in Duke's backyard, is really a result of a certain set of choices about how we are practicing agriculture. So I'm looking over at Norman, who has written extensively and persuasively about alternative forms of growing our food and raising animals. But the reality is that the vast majority of animals raised in this country are raised in the factory farm system. And pigs in particular are raised in such a way that their manure, and I apologize, I know that I should have given a warning for a lunch talk that I was going to be talking about these things, but the way that we handle the manure from pigs is directly resulting in those greenhouse gas emissions, which is good and bad, right? It means that there's an opportunity to change it. There's nothing inherent in raising pigs that means that they have to produce all of this methane, but it's the way that we've the way that we've designed systems to manage that waste that's actually producing it. So the waste is stored in these big open pit lagoons. They kind of, the solids sink down a little bit. There's anaerobic digestion, and that's what creates the methane. If you just have pigs on pasture, they don't actually make that methane. As you mentioned, AnnMarie, their livestock is 15% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And most of that is not from pigs, but is from ruminant animals. So, cows in particular, but also sheep and goats, animals that have a multi-chambered stomach and are really designed to eat grass. And just a natural part of their life cycle, the way that they digest food involves the creation of a lot of methane. And so, a lot of our work on the one hand is figuring out how can we raise pigs in a way where they don't produce any methane. But if we're going to raise cattle, we need to be thinking differently, because cattle are going to produce methane whether they're in a factory farm or whether they're out on pasture. And so some of my other work has been around thinking through, okay, it turns out if you change the way that you manage cattle on pasture so that you're actually moving them around much more frequently, then you cannot ever stop them from producing methane, but you can actually make the soil so incredibly healthy. You can make the grass grow so strong that the grassland is actually sinking as much carbon out of the atmosphere as the cattle are putting up into the atmosphere. And so a big part of what I've been working on recently is figuring out what kind of policy do we need in North Carolina and across the country to try and get farmers to manage their cattle and manage their other ruminants in a way that is essentially focused on that soil health principle, so that if we can't completely eliminate the emissions, we can at least offset them within that system. And so I'll pause there. I know that I've also given a lot of information in a short period of time.
So this is really helpful because you're both introducing important policy questions, from the medical side, from the agricultural side. And I want to now shift the conversation a bit and bring Sarah into the conversation now with AnnMarie to talk about the question of equity, which is such an important question because we know that in the climate change space, we're seeing that there are many communities who have so little that they have contributed in the way of greenhouse gases, but they're going to be affected much more drastically. And so maybe if AnnMarie and Sarah could talk a little bit how, from your sort of disciplinary points of view, how are you thinking about this question of equity?
Sure. I'm happy to give that a start. This gets to the question that I saw Bill ask in the chat, which is beginning with what are the adverse health effects of climate change, and then who do these adverse effects impact? So let me just give you sort of a high-level overview here very quickly. If we just look at the innermost circle and we see that increasing and this is a slide from the CDC, increasing carbon dioxide levels lead to rising temperatures, which leads to more extreme weather and rising sea levels. And then if we go one ring out from that, we can see that these rising temperatures cause extreme heat, severe weather, air pollution, changes in vector ecology, and so on. And then if we move one more ring out, we can start to begin to see what the adverse health effects are of these of climate change. So when we think about extreme heat and we see the outcomes of health-related illness and death and cardiovascular failure, we have to think about who is most impacted by this. And so we think about people with chronic health conditions already, people who predominantly work and play outdoors, people who are living outdoors because they are housing insecure or cannot afford air conditioning, people who are taking certain medications, even young athletes. We've seen a rise in the number of young athletes coming in for care because of the increase in temperature. So that's just one example. If we move around the circle a little bit, we see that piece about air pollution and asthma and cardiovascular disease. And so we have to think about the burning of fossil fuels here. And that accounts for 8% of deaths worldwide. And again, those who are the most vulnerable are those with chronic health conditions already. If we move down a little bit further, just to give a couple more examples and look at changes in vector ecology, we have to think about Lyme disease, which has more than doubled. We have a much higher tick population than we did in years prior. We have to think about having more breeding ground for mosquitoes, which introduces more cases of West Nile and Zika and malaria. And we can even think about how human-mediated factors have driven zoonotic diseases such as COVID-19. I skipped over that blue one, but I think it's in a funny place because the mental health impacts really should be, in my perception, and I definitely won't take this up with the CDC, but sort of the outermost ring around all of it, right? So there are naturally some mental health impacts of living with a heat-related illness or experiencing malaria or Lyme disease or living with asthma or cardiovascular disease. And so the mental health risks and outcomes to be considered in all of this, there are some groups, again, that are more at risk than others. And so in the course that I teach on population health in a global society to master's nursing students, there are about 250 that come through this core course a year. The goal is to really see how the consumers are not always those who are experiencing the most adverse outcomes, and that adverse outcomes of climate change and other things are not equally distributed across a population. So this gets to the equity piece. Who is most at risk? Who is creating and causing climate change, and who is most at risk for the outcomes? And that's what I think Sarah is also going to touch on.
Thanks, AnnMarie. That's super fascinating. And I want to stay on this theme of health linked to climate change, but talk about food security. And most of my research has been not based in the United States, but based in developing countries, and in particular, looking at the role of smallholder farmers and agriculture. and the impacts that climate change is having on them. So just to give a little bit of data to make it a little bit more concrete, there are over 500 million farms worldwide that are what are called smallholder farms. So less than 2 hectares of land where people are growing either food for subsistence or sometimes for markets, but just at a small scale. And disproportionately, these smallholder farmers are on the front lines of climate change, and so they are facing a situation. And to be clear, and this goes back to something that Lee and AnnMarie were talking about, and that Norman brought up at the beginning as well, that these are not future impacts that we're talking about. Already, people are experiencing large decreases in the yields of their crops, particularly in countries located near the tropics. And so to bring up a point that AnnMarie was saying, really the most vulnerable populations are the ones that are being hit by this. So smallholder farmers often just growing enough food to feed their families, but they're living in already poor areas that have lack of resources for adaptation, and they are, they're on the front lines of climate change. So the yields are going down on their crops. This is due to things like drought, changing weather patterns so that they don't know exactly when to plant crops in order to get the best rain, increase in storms that wipe out crops. But we're also seeing, and this is, I think, one of the lesser known facts, we're seeing a decrease in the nutritional value of the food that's being produced too. So climate is not only decreasing the amount of food that's being produced in many of these situations, but it's also changing and decreasing the nutritional value of the crops. So that this is kind of having a double effect on food security and nutrition for people in these areas. One of the more shocking to me statistics, or not statistics, projections that's out there, is that without migration, by the year 2070, about 1/3 of the world's population could live in conditions that are currently approximated only by the situation in sub-Saharan Africa, right? So you're talking about, and really in the Saharan desert. So 7.5 degrees Celsius increase in temperature in some of these areas, way above the global average. And these are almost exclusively poor areas already. And so when we're talking about equity and these impacts, really seeing this playing out in some of the poorest areas of the world. In terms of solutions to this, thinking, as we started off talking about, mitigation is the big solution. Like let's decrease the future impacts of climate change through strong mitigation policies. But even with that, because these effects are already happening, and because no level of mitigation is going to stop the impacts in the near term, we also have to think about adaptation strategies and ways of working, particularly with the most vulnerable, directly with them to understand what their needs are, but also thinking about financial solutions to helping people who are living in some of the poorest areas of the world who did not contribute anything at all really to the climatic changes that we're seeing, but are on the front lines of experiencing it.
How about we bring Lee into the conversation now with Sarah to talk a little bit about this issue of community stability and instability that's going to follow from climate change effects. We know that rural people in particular are really on the front lines of so much because they are landed people, which means they are very closely tied to weather systems, weather patterns. They're also very closely tied to things like irrigation, drought. These issues are enormously significant. And when you have a situation of great instability, which is what climate change is going to bring about, can you talk a little bit about how this is affecting community stability or instability in the spheres of work that you do?
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to start off with that. So what we're seeing in a lot of the rural areas in Central America where I work is a huge increase in out migration from those areas, and I'm sure most of the people who are participating today are familiar with the news out there about people showing up at the U.S. southern border. And there's been a huge change in the makeup of people showing up at the U.S. southern border, where in the last several years, a lot of people coming from El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, many from rural regions, and many arriving as families. And that's kind of very different from the types of migration that we had seen in the past, which were often an individual person coming, migrating, sending remittances back home. But really we're seeing, particularly following the droughts in 2014, 15, and then 2018, kind of huge mass out migrations where some of these, states within these countries are losing close to 10% of their 10% of their population over a relatively short period of time, of people who just can't feed their families anymore where they are. And it's creating lots of stress on the systems both in those countries, because there's a whole economy that's based on people being there and growing food and contributing to food security within the countries. And then, of course, also, in the migration patterns of people are taking through Mexico and up into the United States. And this is confounded by the fact that there's no international definition of what it means to be a climate migrant. And so people talk about, well, people are moving because of climate change. And one of the things that I like to say is, people in these rural areas, in Central America at least, people are leaving their farms because of climate change. They don't want to leave most of the time. They would prefer to stay. In many cases, they have multi-generations that are tied to the land. They want to be there. But they're leaving because they can no longer no longer grow food where they are. But they're leaving. So they're leaving their farms because of climate change, but they're leaving their countries because the countries themselves are actually quite unstable and have a lot of violence. And so internal migration options are not really viable. So we start to think about solutions for this. One of the tragedies of this situation in Central America and the migration that's coming to the United States right now, where people don't want to leave their homes but are leaving them because they can't make a livelihood there, is that we actually have a lot of knowledge in the international community about how to invest in water smart agriculture and climate smart agriculture practices. And we're not doing a very good job of rolling that knowledge out to those, globally 500 million smallholder farmers that are on the front lines of climate change. Just making better use of the knowledge that we already have would make a huge impact on people's ability to be able to stay where they are if they choose to, and make a living in their own communities and contribute to their own communities. And so, from a policy perspective, just having programs that provide, in the United States, I grew up on a farm. In the United States, we have agricultural extension services, right, where people can talk to experts and understand a little bit more about changes that are going on in their farming community. And in many developing countries, those types of services don't exist at all. People don't have a resource to find out what crops are going to grow better on my land. What types of, practices should I use in terms of planting cover crops, or types of tillage that people should use, or types of nutrients that are rich in their soils or not rich in their soils. They don't have access to this knowledge, and it makes it very difficult to make those water smart decisions that could allow them to adapt what they're doing and remain in place even with climate change happening. And I want to bring in Lee here because I know he has a very unique perspective from North Carolina as well.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. And I'm just struck by there are so many parallels, I think, in the populations that you study and in some of my work as well. I'm very focused on the domestic case, and especially in North Carolina, but I think we're seeing a lot of the same factors at play. We're seeing a lot of folks. I think we've heard more and more recently about the hollowing out of rural America, and that is symptomatic of, I think, some of the same pressures, climate pressure for sure, but we've also seen farming in this country become more and more precarious, driven not only by weather, but driven by a series of policies since the 60s or 70s that have been really accelerating the consolidation of agriculture and of farms in general in rural America. And that, of course, has the, if your work really focuses on how to help smallholder farmers become more productive and to adapt to climate change so that they are able to stay put, or that they are at least able to live off the land. I think a lot of my work is really focused on thinking through the way that consolidation has made it impossible for many farmers in the United States to continue to make a living off of the land, and has forced them into town, either to get jobs so that they can support their farming habit on the side, so that they can stay on the family land, but do so in a way that's not profitable enough for it to take up all of their time. So yeah, anyway, I'm so interested in thinking through, I don't know how much time we have left, but I would love to think through with you how some of the interventions that you're thinking about in terms of foreign aid are maybe applicable to bring back home as well. You talked about the technical assistance that folks are getting from Extension, and Extension is one of the sort of the great innovations in American agriculture, but it's also become, I think, it's also been underfunded, and most of the farmers that I know have trouble getting the kind of advice that they need from Extension, and are more often relying on each other, relying on the internet. So I don't know, maybe you have a perspective on that.
I mean, it's absolutely fascinating to think about, some of these same challenges happening in North Carolina and happening around the world when it comes to the agricultural sector. I will say, obviously the internet and those type of technologies are absolutely great resources, right? So even, my farming parents were talking about planting cover crops in Western New York in a way when I grew up there, we weren't planting cover crops in Western New York, right? So there is this kind of growing, whether it's through word of mouth or through Extension, people thinking about new practices. But I agree that to the extent, whether the food has to grow somewhere, right? Like, we can't ignore rural communities. We can't ignore agricultural communities because it's part of a very, intricate food security web and food systems web that we need to think about. And so I think really figuring out a way to invest in rural communities, whether it's here or abroad, so that they can, continue to contribute, as they always have done, to the food security, not only of themselves, but globally, but do it in a more sustainable and, both sustainable from a climate perspective, but also sustainable from a livelihoods perspective way. That's really the only way that we're going to be able to feed an ever, a growing global population, but also help farmers where they are.
Let's bring AnnMarie into the conversation now. I think I would like to just push a little bit further in this question, and it was raised partly by Oliver, about how do we sort of develop an international response, a coordinated response to some of these issues. And I'm thinking particularly about how do we build something like community resilience or regional resilience, because obviously the better way to go is to not wait for the disaster to just get so bad and then address it, but to try to do preventative kinds of measures that would help us as we anticipate the kinds of ill health effects or food insecurity effects or migration effects. Do you have any thoughts about how we can do this sort of preventative work and at the policy level, international level either?
That's a huge question. It's a great question and a huge question, and I'll do with it what I can, which is to say that I think in the way that we teach our students. So first of all, we as nurses remind our students that we are the most trusted profession, right? And so many years running in the United States, and so patients look to us for solutions and also for education. And so some of what we say is to not only be prepared to treat conditions that are related to climate change, so to learn how to comprehensively treat COPD and asthma and heat stress and all of those kinds of things, but to learn how to listen to patients' experiences, to be drivers of policy change, and to be able to speak to our legislators about the fact that this is what is impacting our patient experience. This is what is impacting our communities, and to kind of be that voice at a local scale. I'll mention, I know I said, and I saw this in the conversation that Sarah and Lee were having as well, that what's local is global. And our course is called Population Health in a Global Society. But one of the assignments that we have the students do, again, to see the unequal distribution of outcomes even within a county, is to take a look at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation's county health rankings, and then to look at like air pollution data from the EPA, and to start to make connections about, okay, air pollution issues in this county are not equally distributed, right? It's the people who are living closest to those CAFOs that Lee was talking about, or the impaired waterways are really most impactful for the subsistence fishers in the county. So it's to begin to say, what are the issues globally, but also what are the issues locally, and to listen to and begin to be able to know how to represent the voices of people who are struggling with these issues at a community level and at a global level. So I don't know that I've answered your question necessarily about prevention, but I will say that I think part of what we are teaching Duke students to do is to think globally, learn locally, act locally, and especially in nursing, to listen to their patients and their patient experiences. But I open that to my colleagues as well, because that was a really big question.
Let me jump in, AnnMarie. I think it's such a good perspective. And what it makes me think of is that a lot of the work that I'm doing with students right now is thinking through the trade-off between global greenhouse gas mitigation and some of the local environmental issues that poses. And it may seem, I think most of us think reducing a ton of greenhouse gases anywhere, as we know, anywhere in the world is good for all of us. But those benefits are not evenly distributed. I mean, as Sarah pointed out, there are parts of the world where she works that are experiencing the effects of climate change much more severely than we are here in North Carolina. And the populations that I work with most commonly are at risk of actually experiencing worse pollution in their communities because of efforts to decarbonize the electricity sector. So it's possible that hotspots can develop when you're attempting to reduce overall emissions. You can actually end up with pollution kind of more concentrated in one area. And inevitably, it's concentrated in among communities that have already borne a disproportionate impact from climate change and from the factory farms that I work on most closely.
Yeah, thanks to AnnMarie and Lee, and thanks to Norman for the question. I mean, I would say, not to try to be too simple about it, but one of the number one things that the United States and other rich countries can do is to increase the amount of and the effectiveness of the foreign aid that they're providing to other countries. So, less than 1% of the United States federal budget is spent on foreign aid. People think it's a lot more than that, but it's not. And it's about 0.2% of the United States GDP is spent on foreign aid. It's like 0.2%, and which is well below the international targets for spending. But it's not, of course, just about spending more money. It's about spending it effectively. And when we're looking at people who are on the front lines of climate change, a very small fraction of the amount of foreign aid that we're spending is actually going to rural communities. It's difficult to work in rural communities. Sometimes they're hard to get to. Sometimes there are not, good systems on the ground in place to work with. And so you have to build more from scratch, and you have to learn to speak local dialects or have interpreters who can speak local dialects because you might not speak the main language in the country. And so figuring out ways to do both, more foreign assistance, but also better and more effective foreign assistance to help some of these people who are really experiencing climate change in a way that is very disproportionate to what they have contributed to the problem. But also, I mean, just from this is not how I tend to look at it, but even from a U.S. self-interested point of view, if we don't help with problems where they are, those problems are going to radiate out and are going to affect the United States even, more directly. Whether that's through people coming, to our shores, or through, food systems that are being, affected by climate change, in other countries, but then having an effect on our ability to get produce whenever we want it in the United States, or things of that nature. Even things that have climate impacts on other shores will come to the will reverberate to the United States. It's not just the ones that affect us directly here. And so thinking about how we engage with other countries to help them deal with climate change and adapt to climate change where they are, I think is going to be extremely important.
Well, this is really helpful. So Jess, in the chat, she raised the question about, yes, we can talk on the policy level, which we clearly need to do, but she's also interested to know what suggestions you have in the more personal or community level. Right? What can individuals be doing to be thinking, addressing climate change in their own spaces of life. You all must have good ideas.
There are so many things. I don't even know where to start. I'm thinking about, again, sorry that I'm speaking to you as a nurse from this nursing perspective, but there's this group called the Nurses Drawdown. And so they ask nurses to make a commitment to video record themselves, making a commitment to making one small change that will impact the planet and our environment. And so some of the things that are on there, we've already talked about: committing to eating more of a plant-based diet, using cleaner cooking, cleaner burning cook stoves, and we're hearing a lot more about this within the U.S. and abroad. Reducing food waste, walking to work, biking to work, doing alternative transportation, commuting with others, planting trees, protecting forests. There's a lot that, and even thinking about gender equity issues as part of the solution, advocating for women and girls to have more education and family planning opportunities has an impact on the environment and on climate. So there's a lot that we can do at an individual level that would really make a difference. And I think this idea of just committing to one change, one small change, is a really good opportunity that the Nurses Drawdown presented.
I just saw Jim's comment in the chat: educate, organize, agitate. I love that, and fully support that, Jim. I think those are often bigger commitments. Going back to the small commitment, I'm a big fan of farmers markets, not so much because I think that they are necessarily the solution to climate change, but because I think that they're a great opportunity to meet people who are involved in the daily work of growing your food, and that once you start to meet farmers and develop relationships with them, you start to look at the landscape in a different way. You start looking at their work in a different way. You start to appreciate your food and where it comes from in a different way, and that can lead to a new motivation to get educated and get organized and start agitating. So that's what I would encourage you to do.
I would also lean into the education, and I would say, so educating yourself, but I would also say having conversations that meet people where they are when it comes to climate change, which is a much more polarized issue in the United States than it is in many other countries in the world. So there are many countries of the world where your attitude about climate change does not depend on whether you're on the right or the left of the political spectrum. But in the United States, it has become somewhat of a polarized issue. And figuring out ways to talk to people about the impacts of climate change without having to solve all of the vocabulary that goes along with talking about that. So I was giving a talk in Arkansas recently, and there were a lot of people, and I was talking about climate migration from Central America, and Arkansas is, of course, a big farming state in the United States. And there were a lot of people in the audience who said, when we try to have these conversations locally, people are really shutting down. But then there's this school that was just built that's being powered by solar panels, but the people don't believe in climate change. And I said, well, maybe as long as they believe in solar panels, that's okay, right? Like talking to people about the solutions without trying to change their entire mind about everything could actually have big impacts on and allow us to make these smaller, more incremental changes. We need big changes. We need big sweeping changes, and people who are on board with that can be part of those big sweeping solutions. But we also could have smaller incremental changes of people switching to renewable energy because it is available or cheaper or subsidized or whatever it is, right, that allows them to say, this is the right solution for my community, even if they haven't adopted, or educated themselves about the entire planetary effect of why they chose solar panels. So I think, just thinking about how we engage with different communities when we talk about these issues is going to really be key, particularly in the United States, where this has become so polarized.
This is so helpful. I know one of the people that we have taken a lot of inspiration from in the design of the course is from Catherine Hayhoe, who is, the director of the National Nature Conservancy, but also has been very active in just communicating climate change to diverse audiences. And she says the thing we have to do best of all is simply talk about it, because we're not talking about it. And you raised this good point, Sarah, about how do we talk about climate change when that word climate change can be so off-putting to people or agitating to people. And I'm thinking of an example of an ecologist friend who wanted to learn about climate change effects in agricultural communities. And so she went to poll farmers and she would ask them, how are you seeing climate change working out in your agricultural work? And they said nothing. They refused to speak. So she came back to her colleague and said, the farmers won't talk to me about climate change. And her friend said, well, you need to go talk to them about the weather. So she went back to these same farmers and said, how's the weather changed in your agricultural practice? And they couldn't stop talking. So finding ways to speak, that means paying attention to vocabulary, making it personal with people, can be so important. We have another question. They're starting to come in more now. What do any of you have in terms of a feeling or a sense about nuclear energy as a strategy in this time going forward?
So this is one of those areas where I start to get nervous, right? Because I feel like nuclear energy requires nuclear energy specialists to really talk about it and the pros and the cons. And I'm not, to my knowledge, the people on the panel aren't. I will say that I had a colleague in the Sanford school who was an energy economist, and so thought a lot about these things, and leads a course that takes students over to the conference of the parties, climate change talks every year, and so really spends a lot of time thinking about this, and was of the opinion. So I'm kind of giving you someone else's opinion on this. But from his research, was of the opinion that, like, based on current technologies, so of course this could change. That nuclear was a key thing we wanted to consider if we are concerned about meeting our climate commitments and our reduction in greenhouse gases. That is one of the key technologies that can do it. I am not qualified to speak about the pros and cons of that on a non-climate change, on a non-greenhouse gas viewpoint. But there are definitely a lot of climate economists out there who see this as one of the economically viable solutions for reducing our reliance on technologies that produce greenhouse gases.
Okay, we can also then talk a little bit more about this question of hope. This is a question that comes up often in my conversation with people. What keeps you all going in your work? What inspires you in the work that you do? What gives you hope in the work that you do? Because some of the forecasts we know for communities, especially communities in certain regions of the globe, the forecasts are pretty grim. And so how do you sort of inspire your students? How do you get inspiration? How do you have a sense or keep a sense of hope in the midst of this hard work?
I'll say that I draw a lot of hope from our students. They are active and engaged and curious and want to make a difference. And even in the 5 years that I've been teaching this population health course, I've seen a shift in the kinds of language that students are using, the kind of responsibility that they feel in being part of solutions. And that's very hopeful to me. I also want to mention a resource that I forgot about that's available to everyone, and it's called the Climate Fresque. And I had a chance to participate in this because of being Duke faculty. There was a fresque being offered on campus. But there is literally a fresque offered 24/7. They are international. You can go online and be part of a fresque. And what it is it's a 3-hour opportunity to learn the science behind climate change. And it's a little depressing. I'm not going to lie. The first hour and a half is a little bit of a downer. But the last hour and a half is really spent on solutions, and solutions with either an affinity group like Duke faculty. We all did this fresque together from different disciplines, or a group of total strangers from around the world. And that gives me hope too. The fact that there are folks out there educating about climate change and its causes and its consequences, and there are people brainstorming about solutions.
That's really helpful. I know that in class, one of the things that we got from students over and over again, what's the solution? Thinking that there is one solution. And we said we need to get away from the kind of thinking that says there's a silver bullet that's going to make this all get better. And we said that the better image might be silver buckshot, because it's going to require all kinds of people doing their relatively smallish things that, when coming together, really sort of shift the way we think about economy or politics or policy. Lee, you got something you want to add to this?
Yeah. It looks like you've got at least one taker, AnnMarie, for the Climate Fresque, even despite your selling it as a depressing hour and a half, followed by a more hopeful second half. I agree that my students inspire me and give me hope as well. And it's not because they're not naive, and they're not they're not Pollyanna-ish about the future. They know that climate change is here, that it's going to get worse before it gets better, and that they're going to be living through more of it than I probably am. And yet they also see a beautiful world around them that they want to be a part of and help improve. And that's what they're here at Duke to learn how to do. And it's my great job and great privilege to be part of the group of people who can do that. And so, what I emphasize to them is just to not lose sight of the things that they love. I have an 11-month-old. That's certainly something that if it doesn't give me hope, certainly gives me a reason to fight for a different kind of future. And I can see all of similar. Most of my students don't have kids, but they all have something that they're deeply in love with about the world and think is worth fighting for. And so that's kind of where I draw a lot of my hopeful energy from.
I would say the increase in both knowledge and the ability to really try to apply ingenuity and new solutions is one of the things that gives me hope, because you really need both. It's not enough to just be researching new solutions for climate change mitigation and adaptation. You also have to have an increase in knowledge so that people realize that these are things worth investing in. And I do think that we are moving in that direction, where more and more people are educated about climate change, its impacts, that this really is something that's affecting us now and will continue to affect us in the future, and that there are things we can do about it, both in terms of changing our own behaviors, but also investing in research to help, and investing in knowledge dissemination so that we can get knowledge out there into the hands of more people who can use it. And those things are improving right now, right? And so that to me is, well, there are metrics that are going in the wrong direction. There are also things that are going in the right direction. And I think those are actually really big and important things.
So Margaret asked, I think, a really important question around the ethics of consumption. It's fairly clear that one of the ways to characterize climate change is to say that we're living in the great acceleration, in which we've seen the mass production of so many products that are then being purchased by consumers, and it's doing a lot of damage. Do you have any thoughts about consumption as it relates to your areas of work and how we might think better about being consumers? Like, I'm thinking particularly of food consumption, right? As consumers, does changing the kinds of food we buy, obviously, AnnMarie, you talked about more plant-based diet, but should we be thinking in other directions as well around consumption of food?
It matters tremendously. I shared some of the skepticism, from the comments about the extent to which any one individual change in diet can make a difference, which is not to say that you shouldn't make that change, because those things add up and they send signals upstream that folks react to. But this is also a farm bill year where our nation's agriculture policy gets revised and rewritten, and so it would be a shame to not encourage you, if you're interested in, for example, in how to change the food that you eat. What really matters is what policies are being passed down to farmers and what they're reacting to. They're all growing to a policy. They're not growing to the diet that you're specifying. But that said, I think the shift away from very meat intensive diets is important for me in my own sort of diet and my own shopping habits. I do the grocery shopping for our family, and what I'm really looking for are the ways in which the food is grown and by whom. So anything I can do to shorten food miles, anything I can do to get food that was grown, in my county or, in my region, I will do. And that especially goes for animal products. And what I'm looking for there is things that have been ethically raised from the perspective of both the animals and the human communities that live around those farms. So there's a lot you can do. It's not terribly difficult it can be very overwhelming when you're standing in the grocery store and you're confronted with all of the different labels that are on an egg carton, right? But if you do a little research beforehand, it's pretty easy to figure out, I think, how to shop more in line with your own values. And I would never discourage anyone from doing that.
Well, thank you. I think this is a really good note to end on, where we as consumers and as citizens have tremendous power in the kinds of choices we make when we purchase products, but also when we vote at the ballot box. So thank you so much to you, Sarah, Lee, and AnnMarie. It's been a pleasure being with you, and it's been a pleasure with you being with the Alumni Association.